And believe me, I have seen, studied, analyzed, gone through an entire stack of letters in mother's own handwriting, her correspondence with the priest of the Rameshwaram temple. Fantastic. The experiences that she was undergoing, the kind of meditation and power that he was exchanging with the mother. And you get to realize in the deeper essence, what is the kernel, or as Amal would call it, Amal Kiran would call it, the kernel of religion or the kernel of Hinduism is. So I think it's very difficult to be judgmental. Mother had said this, yes, but then this entire stack of letters of hers with the priest of Rameshwaram, the Rameshwaram temple. I handed it over to Peter. I hope it just found its way in the archives. It's there. So these are very interesting things. I think when it comes to Mother and Sri Aurobindo, we need to have a hugely open mind and not because Mother herself would contradict often. Like if they went and met her, she would say something. If I went and met her, she would say on the same issue, she would have said something different. Perhaps absolutely opposite. But there was a tremendous connect that you could feel, and as this is the 100th year of her final arrival in India, there was a tremendous, not even connect, there was a tremendous identity with what Bharat was. When she says India is like Shiva, it's like when Sri Aurobindo says that I see Vasudeva, even in the rods of the jail. And when Mother says India is like Shiva, she has experienced, she has identified, as she would say, connaissance par identité. She herself lived that. And I had this feeling increasingly when you read her, that tremendous interest that she took in the 1971 Bangladesh War, General Dua, 1971 Bangladesh War. She would sit every day during that very difficult period and focus on the map. Colonel Bhalla is no more, but I remember last time I met General Rodrigues, he died a few months after that, SF Rodrigues, General Jacob, General Jacob, JFR Jacob. And the first thing he tells me, when I told him, that I grew up in Pondicherry, I studied there, the first thing that General Jacob tells me, oh, Mother used to write to me, and she told me, during the war, she wrote to me, that go there, I am there already. So you realize as you read her later writings, there was a tremendous identification with India. There was a total spread, total vastness. I don't know, I feel there's a lot of limitation. I'm unable to explain it. Mother herself would feel that limitation when she was trying to explain a certain experience to Satya. That you won't understand it because the words are not. It's very difficult. I'm unable to exactly explain what I'm trying to say, but the tremendous identification with the vastness and depth of Bharat. The other thing is that I think Sri Aurobindo and the Mother were the greatest realists and had the greatest affirmative vision when it came to India. Show me one line, one paragraph, where they have exuded a sense of impossibility when it came to anything. But since we are focusing on India, a sense of impossibility or a sense of dejection, not one. I challenge. No pessimism. Fantastic. A complete affirmative vision when it came to India. And of course, Shyama Prasad Mukherjee had a very interesting relationship with Sri Aurobindo and with the Mother, because there was a period when a number of disciples in Bengal, because at that time it was undivided Bengal and it was under the rule of the Muslim League, and there were many disciples who were active, who were activists also. They wanted a direction because Subhash Bose had left, C.R. Das was no more, and they were not the Gandhian types. So what to do? And Sri Aurobindo instructed them to join hands with Shyama Prasad Mukherjee and strengthen his role in trying to preserve and protect at least a portion of Bengal. And it's a very interesting anecdote that after he resigned from the central cabinet, and why Shyama Prasad Mukherjee resigned, that entire thing will come to that, and I'll bring in Sri Aurobindo there also. When he resigned from the central cabinet, Shyama Prasad Mukherjee resigned in April 1950, and he wanted to meet Sri Aurobindo after that. The Janasangh was founded in October 1951. So between April 1950 and 51, he wanted to meet Sri Aurobindo. Now I say there are these are the ifs of history. Had he met Sri Aurobindo? So he wanted to meet him because after post 47, Sri Aurobindo relaxed his seclusion a bit. He would meet public personalities. For example, when he received the award, the C.R. Reddy Award, he met the governor of Madras, came and gave him the award. There's a very beautiful letter where he's saying that I suppose you know that I don't go out. And you had the French Schumann also who came and met him. So he was meeting people. K. Munshi had the last meeting with him in July 1950. So Shyama Prasad Mukherjee wanted to meet him, but instead of writing to the mother, I think he thought the easiest thing is to write to Dilip Kumar Roy. Dilip Kumar Roy, and I say the ifs of history, Dilip Kumar Roy, without informing the mother, wrote back to Shyama Prasad Mukherjee saying that Sri Aurobindo is not well and he's not meeting people. So that's it. It didn't happen. And in December 1950, when Sri Aurobindo left, and this I got it from Himanshu himself who told me, he said that I got a telegram, I got a telephone call after I had come back from Pondicherry that Dr. Mukherjee wants to meet you. Their houses were just about 500 meters away. So he says, I came back from office, went to his house. He caught hold of me and embraced me in tears. And he said, everything is over, I wanted to meet Sri Aurobindo. So he said, why didn't you write to the mother? He said, no, I wrote to Dilip Kumar Roy, but he said Sri Aurobindo is not meeting me. And so when Himanshu went back to Pondicherry, he told the mother, and he says, mother was so upset. Mother said, why didn't he write to me? He should have written to me. And that is how mother identified Dr. Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, because he was already a very well-known educationist. He was the first Minister of Free India's cabinet as Minister of Industry. Mother designated him as the chairman of the Sri Aurobindo Memorial Committee, which met in Pondicherry in April 1951 to conceive and create this idea of a university center. And that's how, the relationship built up. And I have a very beautiful letter of Nalinda's, which he wrote to Shyama Prasad Mukherjee. That was the last letter, saying that mother sends you her blessings, and I hope you are looking after yourself. And of course, we know when Shyama Prasad Mukherjee passed away in Kashmir, demanding the abrogation of Article 370. Mother had clearly said, mother told Manoj Dasgupta, Manoj Da, that he was killed. And to Pranab Da, she clearly said that it was an unnatural death. And years later, in the agenda, mother says that what kind of leadership do we need in India? We need a leadership which has a tremendous mass base, a leader or a leadership which is open to Sri Aurobindo, and which has the capacity to translate Sri Aurobindo's vision or his thought into mass action. And she says, years ago, and this was quite later, mother was already advanced in age. She says, years ago there was one such leader. That tall and hefty gentleman who had come to Pondicherry. We had invited him. That gentleman. So I think whoever was there prompts her saying that Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, yes. He was someone who could have done it to a certain extent. He was open to Sri Aurobindo. And it's very interesting that in 1950, Sri Aurobindo's last birthday, 78th birthday, in 1950, Sri Aurobindo gave special benediction to Shyama Prasad Mukherjee. He had commissioned a statue of Sri Aurobindo's in Kolkata. The statue was made and it was publicly worshipped, and Sri Aurobindo allowed it on his 78th birth anniversary. The photograph is still there, the statue is still there in Kolkata. I had the privilege of preserving it because when I found it out, it was Sri Aurobindo's hand was standing out. So we have preserved it. I could preserve it. So I just thought, I'll just start with these some prefatory, some anecdotes. I think through anecdotes, because if through evening talks you can get so much on India, through anecdotes also you can get a lot of direction. Because after all, we need something for our own sustenance. And I think these are what sustains me. So I see it, very symbolic, that now I am totally immersed and focused on Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, in the sense that, I head the organization which is named after him. I'm a product of the university center which he was the chairman, the setting up of which he, in a sense, foresaw. Now let me start with a few issues. Really, it's very difficult to give a roadmap or a framework of Sri Aurobindo and the future of India. But I regard the pact as an exceedingly clever move of Liaquat Ali to fish his nation in quotes, Sri Aurobindo puts in quotes, nation, to fish his nation out of the desperate situation into which it had run itself and to secure its safe survival. 3rd May 1950, letter to Amal Kiran on the Nehru-Liaquat Pact. Now, why am I saying this at present? And the last conversation that Sri Aurobindo had, 4th December morning, so to say, a call from Pondicherry Prabhat Sanyal. Sri Aurobindo looked at the watch, it was 10:10 in the morning. And Prabhat Sanyal was having a conversation with him, 4th December 1950. Last thing that Sri Aurobindo asked, and you did not ask me about Bengal. What about Bengal? So Prabhat Sanyal says that I described to him the condition of Bengal, the situation in East Bengal, the situation of the refugees who are coming in, pathetic plight, the torturous condition. And I asked him whether Bengal will not be salvaged. Sri Aurobindo closed his eyes, opened it once and said, yes, Bengal can be saved, but Bengal has to aspire for the divine. And then he closed his eyes. It's very interesting that Sri Aurobindo speaks about the Nehru-Liaquat Pact, which was the root, which is from where the entire CAA narrative, Citizenship Amendment Act narrative, starts. Sri Aurobindo calls it a very clever move by Liaquat Ali to save Pakistan, his nation, quote, in quote. And it is clearly established that during that period, since the Indian leaders pre-independence or just around partition had promised the Hindus, the minorities who were minorities in East Bengal and in Pakistan, that they would be protected in case they felt that they could not live there, the Nehru-Liaquat Pact was brought in. The Nehru-Liaquat Pact was brought in because there was a tremendously strong public opinion at that point of time that since the Indian leadership is duty bound to protect minorities in Pakistan, if Pakistan cannot protect them, India can run through, enter Pakistan and provide protection to its minorities. This was a very strong sentiment that was there at that point of time. And very interestingly, if you look at the Mother India editorial that Aman would edit, India and the World Scene is a collection of those editorials. If you go through, I would recommend, ask all of you to go through that volume, because they're very interesting topics which are so relevant even today. You realize that, and those editorials, as per Aman, were vetted by Sri Aurobindo, were corrected and edited by him, and only when he wired yes were those editorials printed. So I assume that the Mother India editorials between 1949 and 50 broadly reflected the political stand of Sri Aurobindo. And you can always doubt Aman, we can all doubt each other, there's no problem in that, but he's very clear on that. And there are editorials, for example, this one to the refugees of East Bengal, Amal was himself very poetic in his writing, where you clearly see that there was a strong public opinion in the country that if Pakistan can't protect its minorities, India is duty bound to do so. And when this public opinion reached a crescendo, the Liaquat Nehru Pact was brought in, where India promised to protect her minorities and Pakistan promised to protect her minorities. 8th April the pact was signed, and on 19th April 1950, Shyama Prasad Mukherjee resigned from the cabinet, and his historic statement on the floor of the House, where he clearly says that this pact is bound to fail because we will carry out our duty towards our minorities, Pakistan will not. And that is exactly what happened. Within 3 months of signing this pact, you had an increasing number of pogroms against the minorities in Pakistan. Pakistan declared itself an Islamic state, and you had Sri Aurobindo's erstwhile revolutionary colleagues, or juniors, not colleagues but juniors, people like Bhupendra Kumar Datta who had stayed back in Pakistan, revolutionaries like Trailokyanath Chakravarti who were part of the Jugantar group, who write saying that the moment you declared that they declared that Pakistan was an Islamic state to be driven by Islamic ideals and laws, we realized that we, who have lived in this land for generations, have become aliens. And it's very interesting that Jogendranath Mandal, who was the first law minister of Pakistan, member of the Muslim League, a Dalit leader, a Dalit Bengali Hindu leader, on 25th May, Sri Aurobindo's letter is 3rd May, on 25th May, Jogendranath Mandal has a confidential private conversation with a representative of the Hindu in Dhaka. And he says the same thing. He says, your Prime Minister concluded a pact with him, with Liaquat Ali, so that Pakistan could be rescued and saved. So what I'm saying is that, I had the occasion, because in the last 2 months I've extensively written and spoken, gone around the country. So if you asked me, because I have also cited, what would Sri Aurobindo have said on CAA? Sri Aurobindo would have welcomed CAA. As per his position, as per his statements, between 1949 and 1947 and 1950. And the conclusion of CAA today is settling that unsettled fact of history. It gives dignity, permanency, respect to that huge population which was uprooted from 1947 onwards. Now, I would urge you to really read these editorials. It's a very interesting conversation, and especially Sri Aurobindo's this letter where he speaks about the Nehru-Liaquat Pact. Now, if you speak about India as a civilizational state, as a state which is conscious not only of her long heritage, alive to her culture, alive and trying to rediscover and restate her huge spiritual repository, a civilizational state is also conscious about its duty towards its citizens. And that citizenship need not only be defined by the Constitution, it has to be defined through something which for any other terminology we call culture, but it has to be defined through culture also. So if we had made a promise, and if you realize, you see the descriptions that Amal makes of the situation of the refugees at that point of time, and Sri Aurobindo repeatedly asking what is their condition and what kind of succor are they being provided, then at least I have come to the conclusion that we are on the right track. And this was a long pending issue which needed to be addressed, which needed to be for once and all, for once it had to be completely addressed and closed and shut. You couldn't leave this chapter open forever. The issue is whether we recognize that there was this problem. The other characteristic is that you identify that there are problems which need to be addressed and not brushed under the carpet. So it's very interesting that if you look at his position on Pakistan, on Sri Aurobindo's position on Pakistan, of course I don't want to mention this where he says I don't want Pakistan to endure. His position on Pakistan, his use of the word that Pakistan was created by force and fraud. Very strong words. And when you realize that a nation is created by force and fraud, and its only cementing factor is anti-Indianness, in the long run you realize that it becomes a liability for the globe, for our Committee of Nations, in the Committee of Nations as a whole. Now, there was, I think, a feeling that unity has not been achieved. Well, Sri Aurobindo himself says that unity will come, unity is bound to come, but its structure, its dimension may be anything. Sitting today, I think it's very difficult for us to try and delineate the framework of that unity or that reunification. But certainly if you read his letters on Pakistan occupied Kashmir, Gilgit-Baltistan, and it's fascinating. I mean, sitting in that room there for 26 years, the kind of phenomenal perception that he had, and I think it was to Sudhir Ghosh that Kennedy said when Sudhir Ghosh gave him the ideal of human unity, and in that chapter where Sri Aurobindo talks about how communist China is going to overrun and come up to the gateway of India, overrun Tibet. So Kennedy told Sudhir Ghosh that there must be a mistake with the date. So Sudhir Ghosh said no, this was written in 1949, 1950, and it was written by Sri Aurobindo, who never left his room. And so he replied saying that you mean to say here was somebody who lived 26 years, 25 years in a room, never left that, and this is what he wrote, and your Prime Minister tells us to be non-violent, non-aligned today. So you see his perception and you realize that, well, Pakistan occupied Kashmir was very much an issue. So I say that let's go one step at a time. So the mother's flag was hoisted when Article 370 was abrogated. The mother's flag was hoisted on the Ashram Temple. So now the next step is, perhaps if you ask me, Sri Aurobindo and the future of India, that is the recovery of Pakistan occupied Kashmir. Pakistan occupied Kashmir, Kashmir ceded to China also. And very interestingly, you realize that the Janasang's manifesto, right from the early days, the reason why Janasangh was formed, because in his letter, when K.M. Munshi writes to Sri Aurobindo saying, I want to work for the reintegration of Indian culture under modern conditions, Sri Aurobindo says, that is the work that needs to be done. And let us not make bones about, somebody has written, K.M. Munshi wrote, I want to work for the reintegration of Hindu culture under modern conditions. Sri Aurobindo wrote back saying, reintegration of Indian culture under modern conditions. Let's not make too much of it. There was a generation, there are, what Sri Aurobindo represents is that Indianness in the Hinduness at the deeper level. So that's like kind of nitpicking. So when K.M. Munshi is writing this to Sri Aurobindo, Sri Aurobindo is replying that reintegration of Indian culture under modern conditions. Regarding Pakistan occupied Kashmir, Sri Aurobindo says that there was a clear probability that we could have taken back what we had lost, but because of the ceasefire. And then when you come down to 1971, 18th December, just after the Bangladesh ceasefire, Mother says it's not going to happen this way. It's not going to be through a war anymore. This was the last chance. But, we signed the Shimla Pact and we gave back 93,000 prisoners of war. Bhutto took us for a ride. And Mother said this is not going to happen this way, but I clearly see that Pakistan is going to break apart. And you are recording, I am not advocating this pact, breaking apart of Pakistan. Mother says Pakistan is going to break apart. 18 December 1971 agenda, it is there in the Rebirth of India, quoted by Michel Danino also. You can check. And that is one conversation that I keep reading. So she was very clear.
Because she was very clear that till 71, you still had a chance through a conventional warfare. Pakistan had not resorted to terrorism at that point of time. Both of us did not have the nuclear weapon. 75, 74 we got the nuclear weapon, they started theirs, and increasingly in 1998 we both became nuclear weapon states. So a conventional warfare in that sense became difficult. You see, this, Mother broadly said this is not going to be possible. But obviously if you look at it the other way, last year after Balakot, we pulled the plug on, even after the surgical strike, and after Balakot, we pulled the plug on nuclear blackmail. So, in a sense, it's very interesting that we are emerging as a very confident nation. There is a tremendous churning within because there is a tremendous pressure on trying to rediscover who we ourselves are. I'll come to that later. Because 70 years there was a tremendous amount of suppression. Because you had to be correct in certain aspects. You had to be politically correct. And therefore if you spoke about your inheritance, if you spoke about your parampara, if you spoke about your roots, oh well, you were. And if you wrote about it, you were not published, you were not recognized as mainstream. That was a phenomenon onward. I'll come to that. But coming back to Pakistan and to POK. So I think there is a very clear case when Sri Aurobindo talks about reunification of India, let us have it step by step. And when the ultimate reunification is there, that is the ideal. How that will happen, when that will happen, but let us not say if it has not happened in our lifetime, so it's a failure. After all, what is our lifetime? As Jugalda would say, we are like comme bouchon baloté par les vagues. We are like corks on the sea. Waves are coming and pushing us around. Not in our lifetime, but the larger unity. So POK, recovery, and that's why Mother put up that clear injunction where she said that this flag is going to be hoisted whenever India recovers parts of herself in the future. So that recovery of parts of herself is an unfinished agenda. It is happening. And one of the major steps in 70 years was abrogation of Article 370. We integrated, cemented further that integration which was legitimately ours. And so therefore, now when you go up and look at, when you go down and look at the map of, spiritual map of India, some would call it Akhand Bharat, spiritual map of India, tell yourself that yes, the lion is intact. It is now completely integrated. A portion of it still remains. If this could happen, even that will happen. Now, you may have some questions, we can perhaps answer that later. Now there's a very interesting passage that in 1918, Sri Aurobindo writes in 1918, the Arya was then being published. And he says, in the stupendous rush of change which is coming on the human world as a result of the present tornado of upheaval, ancient India's culture, attacked by European modernism, overpowered in the material field, betrayed by the indifference of her children, may perish forever along with the soul of the nation that holds it in its keeping. Betrayed by the indifference of her children. There is a fundamental question that we need to ask ourselves. I did my PhD on education, the national education movement. It's not that it's a badge, I just had a fascination. One of the former vice chancellor and minister asked me, why are you doing a PhD on Sri Aurobindo? Do you want a job? I said, no. Ever since childhood, I had a fascination. I want to do a PhD on him. That is why. He just gave me such a dirty look. I said, okay. So, and you see this, he's saying in 1918. And This was in 1918. And in December 1948, his last message to Andhra University. This is what he said in 1918. And in December 1948, message to Andhra University. There are deeper issues for India herself. Since by following certain tempting directions, she may conceivably become a nation like many others, evolving an opulent industry and commerce, a powerful organization of social and political life, an immense military strength, practicing power politics with a high degree of success, guarding and extending zealously her gains and her interests, dominating even a large part of the world, but in this apparently magnificent progression forfeiting its swadharma, losing its soul, then ancient India and her spirit might disappear altogether, and we would have only one more nation like the others, and that would be a real gain neither to the world nor to us. It would be a tragic irony of fate if India were to throw away her spiritual heritage at the very moment when in the rest of the world there is more and more a turning towards her for spiritual help and a saving light. This must not and will surely not happen, but it cannot be said that the danger is not there. This is quintessential Sri Aurobindo. This cannot, but surely will not happen, but it cannot be said that the danger is not there. So 1918 to 1948. Please read that. Now, and why I mentioned I did that, the question is, let us ask ourselves, post 1947, in the last 70 years, has our education system been responsive to this, to removing that indifference and to ensuring that we do not forsake India's civilizational swadharma? I don't see a reflection of that in the education system in the last 70 years that has been thrust upon. Neither was there a total overhauling of the education system. Neither did the government of Free India think it necessary to come out and reach out to all these institutions that grew out of our organic sense and experience, like Vishwabharati, and Mother had already initiated the Center of Education in 1943 in a sense. And in 1950-51, it was a purely private initiative. And in fact, if you look at Dilip Kumar Roy's letter to Nehru written at that time, then there has to be some inquiries instituted in the ashram. So don't worry, it's been going on since then. Don't worry. Dilip Kumar Roy's letter. So there was no. You had C. Rajagopalachari presenting his monumental recommendations on education. It was only in 1964 when Dr. Kothari, UGC chairman, who was putting together the Education Commission of 1964, that when Dr. Kothari met the mother, at least he had the sense to come and meet the mother, that, first time mother spoke about that entire division of integral education and how education could. I'm okay, correct, you are the master in this. So, 47 to 64, and I'm saying in the last 70 years, has the education system been able to give rise to this? So, the other thing is indifference. Surely Sri Aurobindo wouldn't have approved. Again, I'm not making any categorical statement. This is my reading. Sri Aurobindo wouldn't have approved of an education system, because if you read his preface to a national system of education, an education system which generates that indifference, which equates westernization with modernization. I mean, there is no issue with modernization. We need to marry technology with education. We need to do that. But has there been, was there a concerted effort and a system where, like Mother puts it very bluntly, that the government of India must recognize yoga? She puts it so bluntly in the 60s. Was there a system of education where this was recognized, where this was pushed through? So I just wanted to bring to light these two aspects, 1918 to 1948, and I think that obviously we are developing in a number of parameters. We are. At the same time, there is a huge grassroots interest that is growing. Initiatives and efforts, spontaneous initiatives and efforts across the country in trying to connect to our roots. And you have so many interesting people having given up a fantastic, their own careers and so many things. They have plunged themselves into trying to rediscover facets of Indianness, various dimensions. Some of you are here right in front of me. So I see this as a very positive initiative, and this is a line which I think Sri Aurobindo had said the danger is there, that we forget our Swadharma. We forget, basically, to put it very simply, we get deracinated, derooted. This danger was there. But I see now we are practicing international power politics. We are aspiring to emerge as a great power. We are bold enough to settle unsettled facts of history. We are standing up to international opinion. We are molding international opinion. We are trying to rework things within the country. We are trying to bridge fault lines which were left unattended. And at the same time, I see across a spontaneous effort and initiative and trying to preserve, rediscover, reconnect to our fundamental civilizational basics and roots. Now, obviously the other thing is a very interesting secularism. I think this is a point that people, because the original constitution, I mean it's the constitution, didn't have the word secularism. It is when there was a period when we are the children of emergency, I say. We were born during the emergency. And that is when the secularism, I can, after all, I'm wedded to a certain line of thought. So don't mind me if I lapse into certain points and issues. Normally but the point is, secularism, the word was not inserted in the constitution. But we all said that yes, we are a secular country because we are not an Islamic state like Pakistan. And therefore, everyone has equal right and dignity in this country. Of course, there was a point of view which said once upon a time that it is the minorities which must have the first right over resources in this country. To that, the present Prime Minister, who was then Chief Minister of Gujarat, said that he believes that it is the poor who have the first right over resources, regardless of which community to which they belong. I think that is a tremendous definition of what we stand for and who we are in that sense. Now, there was a period when, and it's very interesting, I want to also make a point here. It's very interesting because this, these are, like Sardar Patel gave a talk he gave a public, in a public meeting in Kolkata in 1948. Why I keep referring to this period, because it's very interesting because Sri Aurobindo was there physically. And it's very interesting, someday perhaps, I tell Dev and Matri Prasad ji that I give up everything, you give me a room somewhere, I'll quarantine myself for a year and write 2-3 books that I need to on Sri Aurobindo. So in 1948, Sardar Patel and in 1950 Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, they made a very interesting point. They said that, look, those who demanded Pakistan, a majority of Indian Muslims demanded Pakistan. And I'm coming to brass tacks. We're just having a kind of a tete-a-tete, that's why. A majority of Indian Muslims demanded Pakistan. But when Pakistan was formed, a majority of Indian Muslims didn't go to Pakistan. They stayed back in India. It's another matter, when I go to the interior of West Bengal now, those refugees, they ask me, they tell me, what is that Shaheen Bagh there? I said, yeah, they're protesting, they don't want to give you citizenship. I mean, they have a problem with giving citizenship to you. who are those who are protesting? I said, the Indian Muslims, they're misunderstanding us. We don't want to take away anyone's citizenship, but just they feel that they don't want to give you citizenship. So there was this one Bengali refugee who asked me this question, and I had to answer. I didn't answer. He said, but their ancestors had demanded Pakistan. I said, yes. But then they didn't go to Pakistan, they stayed back to India. They stayed back in India. I said, yes. And he said, but we did not ask for Pakistan. We considered India our home. So why don't they want to give us citizenship? India is our cultural mother. Hamare maa, amar to maa, Bharat to amar maa. So, so what I am saying is secularism. So we practiced a secularism which was lopsided and which was anti-religious, but anti-religious selectively. So whereby, I don't want to get into this trope of majority-minority, but since that is the lexicon that is normally to be used, where the majority was repeatedly told that it is your responsibility to look after the minority. Wonderful. That is accepted. It is our duty. And when the majority was told that you have to hush up your sensibilities, your feelings, your sense of worship, and your faith, you have no right to publicly speak of it, because you would hurt some people. So this is the kind of, this is in a sense the kind of secularism that was practiced. And in this secularism, what happened was that not only was a vast section made indifferent to their identity and roots, but they were also made to feel that you are not progressive, that you are backdated, that your faith, your objects of worship are to be rejected, and therefore they are not to be accepted or recognized. Now, it's very interesting. So we talk about fanaticism. Now, it's very interesting that Amal writes about revivalism and secularism. I would like you also to read this chapter from that book. And imagine, in 1949, he's already discussing with Sri Aurobindo's blessings, revivalism and secularism. And Amal says, most of these bigots are a reaction to the fanaticism that was the father of the Muslim League and therefore the progenitor of Pakistan. That was in that context. They are fanaticism. They are the bigots, are the unnatural consequences of a most unnatural phenomenon, and are to a large extent a sort of defense mechanism against a menace that has kept on growing. To discourage them is indeed our duty, absolutely. But if our stand is not equally strong against the root cause of their upsurgence, we fail to be realists. To expect that no section of the Hindu community would indulge in reprisal for acts of injustice and brutality committed against Hindus in Pakistan is simply to be ignorant of human nature. In that context, is then the way to avoid retaliation is not merely to preach Gandhism to the masses or to punish those who take law into their hands, but to add to all genuinely preventive or deterrent measures and attempt to stop the occasions of provocation. The second point to bear in mind about the Hindu sectarians is that in a perverse manner they suggest a truth which should never be neglected. The truth is, it is a reaction. This was in that context. In the last 70 years, what was the context? That if you said that the Cholas were great, that they had a huge empire, Kittuda took us to Gangaikonda Cholapuram. Since then, last 20 years, you have taken your students. So, they and me, in the academic context in the last 70 years, would be considered as revivalists. That you are infusing in your students the glory of the Hindu empire of the Cholas. So therefore, they will not get a tenureship professor in an Indian university. I will not get a project commissioned by the ICSSR if I told them that I would like to write about how Rajendra Chola's ship went up to the South China Sea, and that we were a greater sea power, ocean maritime power than the Chinese, and that the Chinese general called Zhonghe never existed. China doesn't have any documentary proof to give saying that the Chinese general Zhonghe had come to the Indian Ocean, while I have documentary proof to show that the Cholas went up to the South China Sea. I want to write about them. I want to write about the revolutionary nationalists. I want to say that there was a very strong pre-Gandhian movement in India which established the foundations of India's freedom movement. I will get no sponsors. I will get no publishers. I will not get a podium. At least you are giving me a podium to say what I want to say. I will not get a podium. This is the kind of academic apartheid that has been practiced in the last 70 years in this country. As a result of that kind of concerted, systematic intellectual oppression and victimization, in 1960s, Mrs. Gandhi, in her wisdom, I feel she was the last of among those who had a deep sense of India and Indianness. And I'm happy that it is being recorded also. I have a very special letter of hers which I'm going to read out. She outsourced social science research in this country to the Marxists. And please read Sri Aurobindo's letter. The Indian communists will come. Sri Aurobindo has some very interesting points on them also. Will come. It's very interesting. Please read Sri Aurobindo's letter, clarification given to the statesman. You will find it on himself and other letters of historical interest, where he says that three forces have been since inception opposed to the ashram. Now, again, I'm being very politically incorrect. I'm just quoting Sri Aurobindo. And he says these are forces, the Dravidistan people, the Roman Catholics, and communists, who have always opposed the existence of the ashram. There was a report in the Statesman in Kolkata that Satyagrahis sat in front of the ashram. So they were 49. A report in the Statesman which appeared that Satyagrahis sat in front of the ashram and protested. Sri Aurobindo wrote a counter to that. Under Nolita's name, I think, Nolita would send it. That these are the three people, no Satyagrahis. These are the three segments who are opposed to the ashram. They are the ones who have been opposing our work since inception. It didn't change after that, 1965 you saw. And can you imagine that in a free India, Pondicherry was not free, but India was free, 1947, 15th August. I look at the symbolism. Sri Aurobindo's personal attendant goes out of his house, moves towards the ashram main building to attend on Sri Aurobindo and gets his throat slit and dies. Why? Because those groups were protesting. So, this is the kind of atmosphere we generated in the last 70 years. And intolerance towards the other's point of view, toward the other narrative. Because you felt that the idea of India was only your monopoly. It could only be articulated either in UC Berkeley or London School of Economics or King's College or JNU. The idea of India could only be articulated in these universities. You had a monopoly, but if I had a different idea of India, you had no place. And if I protested, if I said that, no, look, listen to my idea of India. My idea of India composes of Sri Aurobindo. It composes of the Cholas. It composes of this. I want to know of Mohenjo-daro. I say that we were already a knowledge society in the past. India had the greatest universities. No. You had to comply to this framework. And that idea of India said that you had to marginalize the majority. You had to denigrate their faith. You had to denigrate their belief. You had to project India as a congery of nations. You had to project India as a nation which is in a perpetual state of conflict, class conflict, a perpetual state of conflict, and that India became a nation only after 1947. And that also, the freedom that was given was a false freedom. ये आजादी झूठी है. So this is one, and the other is secularity. At present, it's very interesting, a shallow skepticism, a preoccupation with superficial factors, a watering down of genuine ethics to weak moralism and sentimental pacifism, a false kind of secularity. Now this is Aman, fantastic, and I assume, and this was seen by Sri Aurobindo, and only when his wire came, yes, Aman would publish it. So I extrapolate a false kind of secularity which forgets that the true secularity for India can lie only in a wide, tolerant, multifaceted, all-comprehensive, plastic, dynamic spirituality. Spirituality was a bad word. You couldn't speak about spirituality because all that mattered to those who controlled education in the last 50 years was that Sri Aurobindo ran away to Pondicherry. He escaped the British. And then what did he do there? He opened some weaving unit, handloom, agarbatti, soap. This is what we were taught. In the sense, this is the narrative that was pushed. And so therefore, you didn't even think it necessary to have a center of Sri Aurobindo studies in any university in the last 70 years. No university in Sri Aurobindo's name. Please read the Rajya Sabha debates when they had decided to name Pondicherry University after Sri Aurobindo. Same DMK. Proponents of Dravidistan, Sri Aurobindo says. 1949. 1982. When proposal to name Pondicherry University after Sri Aurobindo, not Indian. Not at all. So what happened? Pondicherry Central University, PUC, instead of becoming Sri Aurobindo Central University. Please read the entire debate. So he says that these things have obtained sway over half our mind, and the other half that is alive to the divine's presence is unable to find voice and orient our interest and occupation towards the light that in the saint and seer and yogi is still burning amongst us. Any thinker, Marxist, Center for Marxist Studies, lot of funds, tremendous amount. Why this coup development? Why didn't we have a center for saint and seers? Bring out a list of 10 saint and seers after whom you should name centers for studies or encourage research. I am leaving aside mortals like Dr. Shyama Prasad Mukherjee. Because of failure in many responsible quarters to keep bright the instinct of divinity and to live bravely in its ancient unifying force and to develop the country according to the authentic temper of Indian culture, great misfortunes have visited thousands and thousands of the country's inhabitants. So there was no recognition. It's only 2002 or 2003. For the first time, Michel Ganino, under the International Forum for India's Heritage, instituted, with the NCERT's support, because Professor Rajput was NCERT director at that time, they did a study of the need for cultural education in schools. And the finding is fascinating. You realize the thirst that is there. That after 50 years of our independence, we are even having to think of this, and they say that, oh great, Indian spirituality is spreading over the world. Earlier we would say, the tremendous India's moral power, soft power. But ironically, we never did anything to consolidate that sense within the country. So again, if you refer to that line in 1918 and to 1948, and secular revivalism and secularism, if you read this, some kind of a... Now, I just, maybe another 5 to 10 minutes, I need to just start.
Limitation is your time.
No. No, the other is now at towards better towards the end, because now obviously
I think there will be quite a few questions. So 5-10 minutes and then you can open it to
questions. So now it's very interesting that about the please bear with me. And usually I thought if there's a podium, I'm always a little used to standing and. Now, two things. I see Sri Aurobindo's vision of India. There are two things I want to flag. One flag not of India directly, but again in this ideal of human unity, I keep reading this line about the United Nations Security Council. I think he would have surely not been very approved, he would not have been approving of our giving away our seat to China in the UNSC. Because you have a number of editorials during that period of time I have read, where even recognizing Red China was opposed by Mother India. And in fact, Amal writes that in a very strong editorial he had written a very strong editorial, and Mother took that to Sri Aurobindo. Mother also read it, Sri Aurobindo was going through it, and Mother highlighted the passage, said that it's a very rather strong statement that Amal has made on China. Have you approved it? So just a cryptic yes. Mother left it at that. So he had a tremendous, he already foresaw how China was expanding. Communist China, its strategic design over India. And just after the formation of the United Nations, he's writing, a strong surviving element of oligarchy remained in the preponderant place assigned to the 5 great powers in the Security Council, and was clinched by the device of the veto. Even after 75 years, this is exactly the debate that is going on. And he had foreseen it then. And then in the next passage, he's saying that to leave them unmodified, to leave this structure unmodified, prolongs a malaise, an absence of harmony and smooth working, and a consequent discredit and a sense of limited and abortive action, cause of the widespread feeling of futility regarding the United Nations. Already at that point of time, he said. So the debate has not changed. And you see India forcefully making its position, because as Foreign Minister said yesterday, a structure which was formed 75 years ago, if we continue to think that it's still relevant in the way it is, then well, there must be something seriously wrong in the way we are approaching multilateral institutions today. I'm not saying that multilateral institutions are collapsing. In fact, we are using multilateral institutions in a fantastic manner. If SARC has not worked, when SARC was formed, many said that this is the South Asian vision of unity, etc. We have opened up so many other channels, starting with the BBIN and BIMSTEC and SAGAR. So many other, we have rewritten the terms and conditions of neighborhood cooperation. And we have ensured that these terms and condition of neighborhood cooperation is not held hostage to one recalcitrant nation, or nation in quotes. Always please put that nation in quotes, because Sri Aurobindo has put it. It's not a normal country. So therefore, I clearly see that multilateral institutions, there's a lot of churning going on. For example, look at the European Union. Europe itself is in the midst of a lot of churn. So that's why I find it very intriguing that when the European Union ambassadors advise us on CAA, they have undocumented populations which they are unable to handle, which they are unable to address. And these are populations which don't want to be absorbed in the classical European civilization and life. That's a separate topic, But what I'm saying is that, Sri Aurobindo, if you look at multilateral institutions, yes, a sense of the globe, a sense of the world is increasing. But there is also a clear pressure on multilateral institutions by India. And when Sri Aurobindo says position in the in the Committee of Nations, there is a clear pressure from India that yes, we are rising, that we seek our legitimate space, our sphere in multilateral agencies, and this is a legitimate demand. Because by omitting us, or by reducing our capacities or our role on multilateral forums, you are negating this huge segment of humanity. So this much for UNSC. Now, finally, the challenges. Challenges are, I'll just list out the challenges as I see it. Being a student of education, I feel that the restructuring and overhauling of the education system is a challenge which needs to be addressed. But at the same time, as I was talking with my young friend, I see a plethora of experiments mushrooming across the country directed at education. People coming up with new ideas, new institutions, new structures, new experiments in education. And if you look at it the other way, there are a large number of private universities coming up. After all, in India, education was the responsibility of the community, civilizational India. Dhanam to Shiksha was the greatest Dhanam. So there are records. G.W. Leitner, who was principal of the Oriental College in Lahore, he made a survey of education, like Dharampalji did on the beautiful tree Dharampalji's. Please read that, you know. India had one of the most deep-rooted structures of indigenous education. And G.W. Leitner is recording, because Dhanam to Shiksha was considered the greatest Dhanam. You had the peasant, the small shopkeeper, the robber, all at the end vying for, giving some donation for education. So I don't have that kind of hang-up. I'm not of the socialist type who say that private education is, we are products of private education. So I see a lot of interesting institutions coming up, but it was the responsibility of the king and ruler also to ensure that no student who wanted to genuinely learn was deprived of it. Therefore, the state in India cannot abdicate also. But the state in India has to be more imaginative in its approach to education. Like, we are equivalent to BA, BSc. I had done a PhD now. Okay. Equivalent. So the word equivalent. So the government of India still now will never recognize me and say equivalent to BA. It is another matter that the education that we received in Pondicherry was so grounded, was so thorough, that I could go and sit for the first time in my life for a competitive exam and get through. All India competitive exam also. In main universities also and get through. That is a different matter. But what I am saying is that the state, the government in India must recognize the uniqueness of Indian educational experiments that are going on. Try and evolve. So you have a board which has now come up for Bharatiya education. Let us see how it evolves. But if that board takes some root, if it stands, because the bureaucratic pressure is also huge, status quo is pressure of the bureaucracy. But if that board stands, then you realize, can that board gradually also recognize these unique experiments? The Gurukuls, the Ekal Vidyalayas, our own system of education in Pondicherry, the free progress system. Vishwabharati, Shyama Prasad Mukherjee had said, please don't convert it into a central university. Support it, but maintain its purity. They could not do it. They did not, because they converted it into a central university. Mother did not want Pondicherry, the center of education, to turn into a registered certified university, because she said then the experiment would go. Absolutely. If you look at Vishwabharati, you realize today where Vishwabharati stands. There is some effort at trying to recover. But 60 years, 1951, in interim parliament, the Vishwabharati bill was debated, even before the first Lok Sabha elections. Now, education. Then, obviously, you have this pockets of separatism. Whether we want that complete, or whether within India you demand separatism. A mentality of separatism more than physical. The peculiar demand for Azadi. I don't know what Azadi, because we were Azad in 1947. Within Azadi and Azadi, well, do we value that freedom that is hard earned? And finally, whether we can get over that sense of indifference that has been that has grown in this last so many decades. Of course, I leave this out also. If you want me to pointedly point it out, communism continues to remain a problem, a headache. It's not a, it wields influence disproportionate to its political representation because it has deep roots within the Indian academia and intelligentsia. And I'm always very presently surprised to read this letter to Amar that Sri Aurobindo wrote on September 19th, 1950, 3 months before. He says that naturally I am in agreement with the views expressed about communism in the manifesto. What was that manifesto? Manifesto was, drafted by Minu Masani. It's very interesting, you see, Sri Aurobindo had an entire line open to all of these people. Minu Masani, Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, Morarji Desai, Jayaprakash Narayan on this side. On that side, Shubhendra Mohan Ghosh, who was of the Congress, Bengal Pradesh Congress, who was a disciple also. He says, I'm in agreement with the views expressed about communism in the manifesto. And that manifesto was a manifesto for the defense of democracy and independence in Asia. And this was drafted by Swatantra Party leader Minu Masani. But Sri Aurobindo says, whatever is done must be something. They were trying to put together a group. Even Sitaram Goel, Ram Swarup were all part of this. Sitaram Goel was one of the foremost, he was one of the activists in this. And Sri Aurobindo says, whatever is done must be something strong and effective. A blow that can tell. Otherwise, the communist movement has become so powerful that it can feed upon the shocks one tries to give it, as one can see in the tussle that is going on in the UNO. Then he says, at the end, of course, I agree with Desai as regards, he says in this, that you need to include socialists like Jayaprakash. And at the end he says, of course, I agree with Desai as regards our standing on the side of Western democracies. I think as a practitioner of real politics, Sri Aurobindo was a master. And this is September 1950. So I'm not going to agree to people who say that, he had withdrawn, he had no more interest in politics. He had just gone off to that level. He was in that level, but he had a solid grip of what is happening. Mm-hmm. And I think he was very clear on this. No sentimentalism, no false sense of morality. What is good for India, that must be done. And at that point of time, our stand must be clear. We stand on the side of Western democracies. So it's a very interesting thing. Sometimes this communist manifesto and Sri Aurobindo's point that a blow must be given which must be telling. It should not be a half-hearted blow. So that's it. At the end, of course, I have a very interesting letter here. I'm trying to avoid answering questions. You see, 3:30. I have a very interesting letter here. Letter written by the mother to Indira Gandhi. Shall I read the French and then the English? Just to show that I know French. Sorry. I'll just read the English, but I can read the French also. To Indira, the Lord wants India to be great and free. In an ardent faith lies true salvation. In the last analysis, the Supreme Lord does everything. We have to be faithful instruments. Blessings, the mother. Now, she writes on 14 September 1983 to Shyam Sundar. Dear Sri Shyam Sundar, I have received your letter wishing to publish the mother's message given to me on 29th August 1972. I have no objection to its being published. Being close to the mother, you would be in a better position to know what she meant by a great and free India. I would say it meant that the Indian people should be more alive to their rich philosophical and cultural heritage and try to observe these high ideals in their daily life. This would strengthen us individually and help us to build a strong nation which would continue our long and ancient tradition of tolerance. We must be firmly rooted in the soil of India, but be ever ready to take and adopt anything that is good and relevant to us from elsewhere. I think it's a beautiful letter, but unfortunately, Indira Gandhi would find no place in the Congress today, and she would be rejected by the communists. I think that is what is the one of the banes of our politics today, is when mainstream political parties start behaving like fringe. And when they try and embed in you a sense that the rich philosophical and cultural heritage and are negated, are nowhere, have no import, and trying to observe these high ideals in your daily life labels you as a reactionary. So well, I just wanted to, this is a beautiful letter I had in my collection. I just thought I'll share. I mean, those who need to reflect should reflect. And because tolerance is not one side. Today, those who are being labeled as intolerant were in any case suppressed for the last 70 years. Ordinary people. So, I don't know whether I have made any sense. It becomes extremely difficult to speak on Sri Aurobindo and the future of India, but as he says, and I think this is something which we need to keep repeating to ourselves. But again, somebody will say he has written it in 1918, it has no relevance today. After that, 40 times he has revised what he has said. I don't know, but this is something which we need to keep reading. Amid all the mist of confusion, there is still the possibility of a new twilight. Not of an evening, but a morning Yuga Sandhya. India of the ages is not dead, nor has she spoken her last creative word. She lives and has still something to do for herself and the human peoples. And that which must seek now to awake is not an anglicized Oriental people, docile pupil of the West, and doomed to repeat the cycle of the Occident's success and failure, but still the ancient, immemorable Shakti, recovering her deepest self, lifting her head higher towards the supreme source of light and strength, and turning to discover the complete meaning and a vaster form of her dharma. So I think, friends, we are at this crucial Yuga Sandhya, a morning twilight. And I think very interesting things are happening, will continue to happen. And ultimately, whatever we understand of Sri Aurobindo's vision of India is going to happen. And as Mother said, fortunately, not because we are there, it is going to happen in any case. So we do our bit. So thank you so much. I don't know whether I've made any sense, but my problem is that every time I